The committee meeting will come to order. We want to welcome our witnesses, Secretary Shanahan, Acting Secretary of Defense, Secretary Heather Wilson, Secretary of the Air Force, General Joseph Dunford, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and General John Hyten, Commander of the U.S. Strategic Command. Before we begin today's hearing, I'd like to provide special recognition to Secretary Wilson. Today is likely her last appearance before this committee as she's transitioning to her new position of President of the University of Texas, El Paso. And I spent about 20 years of my life down there, so I know what you're in for. And we'll miss you dearly. Your service has been to our country has been commendable. And first serving as the United States Air Force from '82 on, and as Congresswoman from '98 to 2009. And culminating as the 24th Secretary of the Air Force. We appreciate all of your service. We will miss you. I've got to applaud and thank both President Trump and Vice President Pence for their renewed focus and cohesive approach to America's resurgence in the space domain, and the support to our national defense strategy, this document here, which is our blueprint. The reestablishment of the National Space Council, chaired by the Vice President, has provided multiple space policy directives, including the establishment of the Unified Combatant Command and the U.S. Space Command, as well as standing up the Space Development Agency and providing us with the United States Space Force proposal we are discussing today. Space is a warfighting domain, and future conflicts with Russia and China will invoke attacks from, in, and through space. This would profoundly disrupt our society, which is heavily dependent upon satellite communications, positioning, navigation, and timing, and other vital space-based technology. We must restore our margin of dominance in space over our adversaries. The President's leadership and continued attention to this space domain protects the freedom of action these great power competitors would like to disturb. And the unwavering presidential support we have received ensures our warfighters we have the technology and ability to bring America back to greatness in space. Today's hearing will provide us with an opportunity to continue to gather facts, to fully explore the proposal as presented to us. It was just only 4 weeks ago, if you remember, that was right after our budget discussion. In talking with members of the committee and their MLAs, we're all open-minded on the plan, but are wrestling with different aspects of it. And this is one of those rare times when we're having a hearing where people haven't already made up their minds. So we look forward to that. When we first heard about the proposal, I asked two simple questions. What will the organization fix, and how much will it cost? Now, I was going to say I have yet to get satisfactory answers on either one of these, but you have already talked about, it's come out of the administration, that this is going to be a $2 billion program. So for my purposes, I'm going to assume that's right, but I'm still waiting for the answer for the other question. So I look forward to talking about the options, the considerations. Another option could be making the National Reconnaissance Office, the NRO, the Space Office. I consider that would be a viable alternative. We'll be discussing these alternatives in the time to come. Since Senator Reid and I have concluded that since this is such a high visibility and there's so much interest in this, we're going to have, instead of 5-minute rounds, we're going to have 6-minute rounds, and we look forward to dealing with our committee members. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing to discuss the Department's proposal to establish a United States Space Force. Again, I think the timing is appropriate. The administration understands the different challenging demands in space that have evolved very quickly over the last few years, and their proposal gives us something to work with, and I thank them for that. Let me welcome our distinguished visitors and join the Chairman in saluting and thanking Secretary Wilson for her distinguished service. Thank you, Madam Secretary. All of us would agree that space is essential to the security and progress of the United States. It is a critical component of almost every aspect of everyday life, from communications, financial transactions, and navigation to the weather. For decades, the United States enjoyed unfettered access to space. However, as near-peer competitors increase their space presence, space is becoming contested. Eventually, it could be a warfighting domain, and we must prepare accordingly. The question is how. There are legitimate concerns that the Department of Defense is not effectively organized to address the threats posed by our near-peer adversaries in space. Congress has grappled with how to address these concerns. In fact, in 2017, we debated a House proposal on whether or not to create a Space Corps. Ultimately, due to strong opposition in the Senate and questions from senior officials within the Department of Defense, Congress did not create a Space Corps. But we did strengthen the space cadre and space acquisition authorities within the Air Force, and specifically within the Air Force Space Command. Last year, Congress took an additional step and created a sub-unified command for space reporting to the U.S. Strategic Command. This year, the administration has proposed to establish the U.S. Space Force as a new military service within the Air Force, responsible for organizing, training, and equipping all forces who will fight in the space domain. The proposal is essentially the same House proposal we debated in 2017. I fully agree that the threat is real and that changes need to be made to better address the threat. However, creating a new branch of the armed forces for the first time in 70 years is not a decision Congress should make lightly. Such a major reorganization will have long-lasting consequences, both intended and unintended, for how our forces will fight the decades into the future. While the Department's proposal appears comprehensive, there are areas where I have questions and concerns that I hope we can discuss during today's hearing. My first area of concern is the creation of what seems to be a very top-heavy bureaucracy. According to initial estimates, the Space Force will be a military service of approximately 16,500 people. Roughly 1,000 personnel will serve in headquarters positions. Presently, the smallest force is the Marine Corps, with a total force of 246,000 military and civilian personnel and a headquarters staff of 1,200. This Space Force would be in the Department of the Air Force, similar to the Navy Marine Corps model. However, this proposal creates an Undersecretary of the Air Force for Space, whereas the Marine Corps does not have a separate Undersecretary. The proposal also creates two new four-star general officers in Space Force, one for Chief of Staff and the other for the Vice Chief of Staff of the Space Force. The Chief of Staff of the Space Force would be a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I hope our witnesses will explain why the Space Force requires a separate and dedicated Undersecretary, unlike the Marine Corps, and whether such a top-heavy bureaucracy is necessary for such a small fighting force. The Department states that a new military service will significantly increase focus in leadership, expertise, personnel, and culture. With regard to the personnel actions requested, I have some concerns that this proposal may actually have the opposite effect. Of the 16,500 members of this force, 10,500 would be active-duty service members almost exclusively from the Air Force, and a significant number of Space Force general officers would be drawn largely from the Air Force. Therefore, the future pool of officers from which the Space Force would grow field grade and general officers would be small compared to other services and predominantly from one service. This raises questions about the depth, breadth, diversity, and long-term quality of the officer corps. While predominantly made up of Air Force personnel, the proposal seeks to consolidate much of the space activities of the other services into Space Force. The Department is specifically requesting authority for the Secretary of Defense to transfer military and civilian personnel both voluntarily and involuntarily, and their associated budgets and billets to the Space Force. While it is possible all these transfers could be done voluntarily, I believe that scenario is highly unlikely. The connection a service member has to their individual military branch is often deeply rooted and a part of their identity. Furthermore, the Department has not yet decided on what role the Guard and Reserve will play in this new service. This proposal would authorize a new civilian personnel system exclusive to the Space Force that would be exempted from the statutory rules and protections applicable to most other federal employees, including anti-discrimination laws and whistleblower protections. Most notably, the proposal would create a statutory exemption from collective bargaining rights for this workforce and would authorize the Department to involuntarily transfer civilian employees, stripping them of their collective bargaining rights in the process. The Department's initial cost estimate for Space Force in FY20 is $72 million. However, the Department has provided only notional budget numbers for out-of-year budgets, with an estimate the Space Force will require approximately $1.6 billion over the FYDP based on a flat $500 million recurring cost for personnel. It is highly unlikely that the bureaucracy of the Space Force will remain flat over time. I think providing DoD with wide legislative authority to create a new bureaucracy without more robust budget details is risky. On a final point, the National Reconnaissance Office is responsible for our nation's intelligence collection in space. It is a joint organization between DoD and the intelligence community. Clearly, it will play a critical role in space as a warfighting domain, yet it is not yet part of this proposal in any way. I understand there are difficult issues to address in both the administration and Congress on any changes to the status quo, but I'm interested why this obvious seam in the organization of space was not addressed, and I'm interested in hearing from the witnesses on this issue. Again, the threats we face in space are real and clear. They require action. I commend the administration and the Department for taking such action, and we will consider this issue very, very carefully. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Reed. Well, we have 4 witnesses. All 4 will have opening statements, and we'll ask you to try to keep your opening statement down around 5 minutes, because we have a lot of members here, and we're going to have 6-minute rounds, so it's going to take a while. So we'll start with you, General Dunford. You're recognized.
Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to join Secretary Shanahan, Secretary Wilson, and General Hyten here today. Last month, I testified before you that China and Russia have developed capabilities to contest our ability to operate across all domains. This includes space, which is now a fully contested warfighting domain, along with sea, air, land, and cyberspace. As you know, we have conducted joint military net assessments each of the last 2 years to determine our readiness to execute the national defense and military strategies. At the unclassified level, our assessment includes several observations that are relevant to our discussion this morning and highlight that our competitive advantage in space has eroded. China and Russia have taken significant steps to challenge our traditional dominance in space. They have reorganized their armed forces and developed robust space capabilities to include space-based intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. These steps provide the ability to more effectively target U.S. and allied forces. China and Russia are also capable of searching, tracking, and characterizing satellites in all Earth orbits in support of space and counter-space operations. Their counter-space capabilities include jamming, cyber operations, directed energy weapons, on-orbit capabilities, and ground-based anti-satellite missiles. China and Russia clearly recognize the implications of space from both an economic and a warfighting perspective, and as a result, they are adapting. As Secretary Shanahan has in his written statement, Secretary Wilson has addressed, and both the chairman and the ranking member have mentioned, space is no longer a sanctuary. Traditionally, the Air Force has been the principal driver of our efforts in space. And because of airmen like John Hyten, who joins us here today, our capabilities today are second to none. But our current organizational construct was developed before space was a contested domain. As a result of our analysis over the last few years, I have become convinced that we need change to maintain our competitive edge. In the past, we have often effected change in the wake of failure. Today, we have an opportunity, and I would argue an imperative, to change based on our ability to anticipate. We have an opportunity to look to the future and posture ourselves to seize and hold the high ground of space. We've already acted to establish United States Space Command, which will ensure we can most effectively operate in and from space. Taking the next step to create a Space Force will allow us to develop and maintain a singular focus on developing the people, the capabilities, the doctrine, and the culture we'll need to maintain our competitive advantage in space. Together, I believe these steps will accelerate our efforts to develop, field, and operate the capabilities we'll need for joint warfighting in the future. Thank you, Chairman, and I look forward to taking questions.
Thank you, General. Secretary Shanahan.
Great. Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify in support of the Department of Defense's U.S. Space Force proposal. Before we begin, let me pay my respects to the families of the U.S. Marines we lost this week in Afghanistan. While we will discuss elements of national security here today, we know It is America's young men and women who ultimately deliver that security for us and our families each and every day. Let me open my comments on the Space Force by expressing my admiration for our U.S. Air Force. Because of our airmen and Secretary Wilson's leadership in particular, we are the best in space. This proposal is about maintaining the margin of dominance they have given us and accelerating the capabilities we need in this increasingly competitive domain. Establishing the Space Force within the Air Force lets us do just that. It is all the more vital now because our $19 trillion economy, our American way of life, and our American way of war all depend on space. 16 months ago, at your direction, in the FY 2018 NDAA, I began a review to, quote, identify a recommended organizational and management structure for the national security space components, end quote. We are here to respond to that direction, to address the problems Congress, multiple bipartisan commissions, the GAO, and others have all characterized. DoD's space efforts are disaggregated, resulting in a slow, bureaucratic approach. Today, DoD has 5 Senate-confirmed officials who are responsible for more than 10 organizations developing bespoke space capabilities in a very federated fashion, failing to integrate across DoD and to capture the cost synergies of standards. The current approach has served its purpose. We are at an inflection point. Threats are increasing, and the importance of and the opportunities in space are growing. Both China and Russia have weaponized space with the intent to hold American capabilities at risk. Every member of this committee has access to the classified threat picture, but the bottom line is the next major conflict may be won or lost in space. At the same time, an explosion in commercial space innovation is adding thousands of satellites and a new range of capabilities, unlocking $1 trillion in economic opportunity. There is widespread agreement the status quo is not sufficient. Change is required to stay ahead. Approached correctly, this is an opportunity for a generational improvement. Future space capabilities should be system engineered from the start to include launch, commercial innovation, the network, the satellite, the ground segment, user equipment, and cybersecurity. Our military is organized around physical domains, Army on land, Navy on sea, Air Force in the air. Given the significant change confronting us, we now need a military service dedicated to space. Instead of coordinating across more than 10 organizations, we will consolidate and concentrate into the Space Force so that we have clear lines of accountability and responsibility. 2 elements of the Space Force, organized, train, and equip mission, are worth elaborating on. First, today's space personnel go through a professional military education system focused on air, land, or sea. Space is an add-on. The Space Force will build a professional development system that recruits technical talent, educating our people in space from the beginning to produce the quantity and quality of leaders we need. Second, organizing and equipping includes force design and force development. This means understanding the domain, the technology, and warfare deeply enough to design and deliver future capabilities, ensuring space power today and in the future. The Space Force has 2 related components. First, a unified combatant command for space with a full-time commander focused on space operations. Second, the Space Development Agency will develop and deliver the next generation of space-based communications and Earth observation, while existing organizations continue current efforts. The status quo is not sufficient. We need to outpace threats in space, not simply keep up with them. Because our current system isn't organized to move fast enough, the Space Force will consolidate, elevate, and focus our efforts for results. Our partnership with Congress is critical. Our proposal responds to your FY18 NDAA direction, and we stand ready to work with you and resolve any questions or details. We ask your support in making the strategic initiative to establish the U.S. Space Force in FY 2020 NDAA. America has enduring interests in space, and just as the U.S. Navy ensures freedom of navigation of the seas, America's Space Force must now ensure the freedom to navigate the stars. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Secretary Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and Ranking Member Reid and this committee for this hearing and for your service. I would just highlight a couple of points very briefly in addition to what's already been said. The United States is the best in the world at space, and our adversaries know it. And they are seeking to develop the capability to deny us the use of space in crisis or in war. Our responsibility is to make sure that doesn't happen. Second, I would say that it is absolutely imperative that we change the system of acquisition that is modeled more for the Cold War. We have to buy things faster and smarter. The authorities that you have given to the Air Force and to the other services and to the Department of Defense over the last 3 years are in the midst of being implemented, and we are stripping time out of programs and increasing the performance of those programs. In respect to that, the on-time budget this year was absolutely critical. And the fiscal year 20 budget proposal will be the third consecutive year of double-digit % increases proposed by the President and, I hope, supported by the Congress. The third thing I would say is that the Air Force has stood up a planning cell underneath the Air Force that includes all of the services and the relevant Defense Department agencies to do the detailed planning necessary so that within 90 days of legislation, we would stand up the initial element of a Space Force. That planning cell is led by a 2-star general and, as I mentioned, includes all members of the different services. We want to be able to move out smartly when legislation is passed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. General Hyten.
Thank you very much, Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reid, distinguished committee members. It is an honor to be here today and a continuing privilege to represent the 162,000 Americans accomplishing the mission of U.S. Strategic Command. I want to begin by thanking the committee for rightly approaching space as a warfighting challenge, and I very much appreciate the President weighing in and confirming space as a warfighting domain. Now we have to make sure we're ready for that challenge. STRATCOM is a global warfighting command. Success in all our missions require us to maintain freedom of operations in space, and today, as the Secretary just said, I sit here fully confident in our nation's superiority in space. Although we have a distinct advantage today, I fear that this will not continue unless we take action immediately before our superiority begins to erode. Space is fundamental to our economic vitality and the American way of life, including how we conduct warfare. Certainly our adversaries understand this and are actively building and deploying weapons to threaten us in space. We must take these actions seriously. But as the commander of U.S. STRATCOM, I am responsible for space operations in our military today. And I've been in space my entire career. It is my passion. And as much as I'd like to focus on space, my priorities are first, strategic deterrent, second, nuclear command and control, and space can never be higher than my third priority. So the most important thing we can do in the near term is create a lean, new unified command, U.S. Space Command, separate from my command, STRATCOM, focused solely on warfighting in space. And we need a 4-star commander to do that. It's that important. The Department's already taken a step, as well as the President, to nominate General Jay Raymond for this position. He is the right person for that job, and I encourage the Senate to take up his nomination as soon as possible. The second piece is to stand up a new Space Force inside the Air Force, focusing on organizing, training, and equipping forces for this Space Command and for the joint forces at large. This is the pathway that best gets us there. The President said we need a structure inside the Pentagon, focus on space all the time, inside the Air Force, and I support this model. The force needs to be streamlined from inception. I understand your concerns about inefficiencies. I believe the creation of the Space Force within the Air Force is the best way to reduce redundancies and bureaucracies by focusing on the most essential tasks. So I pledge to continue to work with the Congress to develop the most efficient warfighting organizational structure possible. So thank you again for allowing me to be here today, and I look forward to your questions as well.
Thank you, General Hyten. Now, we are going to have 6-minute rounds, and we're going to try to stay within that time frame, I tell my fellow senators. But we also, in my opening statement, I talked about, I had a couple of questions that never have been answered to my satisfaction. Forgetting about the cost thing, because we pretty much established at least an opinion as to what it's going to cost. But I have essentially the same question worded a little bit differently to have each one of our witnesses. So I'd like to ask you to respond to this question. First of all, Secretary Shanahan, I agree with when you often say the United States margin of dominance in space is diminishing. But my question to you, a direct question, is how will establishing a space force help the United States reassert its warfighting dominance? Yes, sir.
Sure. Thank you, Chairman. The fix, I think what you're really speaking to is, how do we expand that margin? Our proposal addresses all of the changes that are occurring simultaneously in space. And maybe just to set up the answer, these are the significant changes we have to address. The environment is contested. We are about to modernize, for the first time in about 30 years, modernize the department. So how do we incorporate all the modernization and address this very different environment, which is a binary change from the past? And as we broke down the problem, we said the fastest way to do this, and it's all about speed to expand our margin, is to compartmentalize the problem into 3 areas. The first was make sure we have warfighting operations so that we can operate in a contested environment.
Yeah, quickly now.
The second was make sure that we have the doctrine and the training so that we can equip our forces with the right space cadre.
Okay.
And lastly, how do we acquire and develop the right system?
So you assume that we're going to do a better job with the Space Force than we're doing right now in those 3 areas. Thank you very much. Secretary Wilson, given your experience, which is vast, can you provide your assessment as to how the proposal will better organize, train, and equip Space Forces compared to the present mission of the Air Force Command today?
Mr. Chairman, I agree with General Hyten that the most important step that the Congress has already taken and the President has put into action, which is a unified combatant command for warfighting. But I do think that there is an opportunity to align defense space programs in a Space Force underneath the Air Force, including acquisition. And I think that that alignment will help.
Okay, that's a good answer. General Hyten, through your role as commander of the U.S. Strategic Command, you are currently the nation's most qualified expert in warfighting, in space warfighting. Can you identify, differentiate between the mission of the U.S. Space Command, a unified combatant command, and the service mission as proposed in the hearing today?
Yes, Chairman. The structure is basically built around the same structure we have in all our combatant commands. The way our military is organized is we have combatant commands that fight our forces. They fight our battles. They win our wars. They conduct strategic deterrence. All the missions are executed through our combatant commands. The new U.S. Space Command will execute the space mission through the combatant command of U.S. Space Command. But the services organize, train, and equip forces for those commands. So the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines builds, organize, trains, and equip forces for the unified combatant commanders. The Space Force will do that for the Space Command and for the Joint Force at large. Nice. That's the difference between the two.
All right. Well, that's a very good specific answer. General Dunford, you're a warfighting Marine, so you have a different perspective than some of the rest of them do on this panel. Do you believe establishing a Space Force will contribute to the development of a space warfighting ethos and culture that does not exist already today?
Chairman, first I'd say I think we do have a good culture in the Air Force, and again, we are the best at space. But I also believe that an organization that has a leadership team and people that are singly focused on a single core competency, that being space, will contribute to culture, but more importantly, will contribute to a focus in those areas that Secretary Shanahan, Secretary Wilson, and General Hyten highlighted.
That's good. Thank you very much, Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses. Secretary Shanahan, as I mentioned in my opening statement, basically the Space Corps is roughly 16,500 personnel. What you will create is a 1,000-person sort of overhead. That is the highest, overhead to operation ratio within the military service by a great deal. For example, the Air Force has 2,300 personnel in their headquarters and 320,000 airmen and airwomen. So how do we avoid that? And why didn't we think harder about coming with a leaner structure?
Sir, let me start with, philosophically, as we consolidate, there should be a reduction in cost. That's how I'm approaching this. The basic proposal has been formulated from an Air Force estimate based on traditional constructs. And what I'd like to do is ask Secretary Wilson to speak to how that proposal was derived.
Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When the department went through this whole evaluation, we looked at a whole range of options, everything from a kind of JAG Corps, medical corps model to a completely independent standalone department, and a lot of things in between. Where we landed was a Space Force underneath the Air Force so that you don't have to duplicate all the acquisition, budgeting, finance, personnel kinds of functions, but with a member of the Joint Chiefs. Now, if somebody's going to be a Joint Chief and they're going to have the credibility in the building and be able to operate, they need to have the support of a member of the Joint Chiefs. Of the additional personnel, which I think is about 1,200, half of those are in the headquarters, which makes for a quite small headquarters for a member of the Joint Chiefs. The other half was proposed to be what is a professional development element to get after the business of developing people. So it is recruitment, professional development, doctrine center kinds of things, which is not really a headquarters element. So we did that costing, and that would be the concept.
Well, thank you, Madam Secretary. And Madam Secretary, your thinking about this this proposal has matured over the last couple of years. In 2017, I think you raised some opposition to a Space Force, and one of the points you made, which I thought was compelling, was you need a joint warfighting team, and this Space Force would, in your terms, be counterproductive in that respect. It would be not a joint enterprise, but essentially an Air Force enterprise, given the distribution of officers and the fact that it would be placed under the Air Force. I see a value to the jointness in everything we do, and are you concerned that we might lose that this might be more siloed out than a joint enterprise?
Senator, I think that each of our services has our own identity, but we contribute to a joint team. I think that one of the most important things in standing up a separate Space Force will be to establish a warfighting culture within that organization that's part of a joint force. One of the things that really has surprised me when I came back to the service, having been away, having served as a young officer, is just how much more joint operations really are today than they were 20 years ago when I was a young officer. And it's a real tribute to the decisions made under Goldwater Nichols.
Again, I think this is an issue that we'll return to again and again, but there is this tension between creating a service, a separate identity, and this notion of jointness, which I think you're correctly stated, emanated from Goldwater Nichols and has been, I think, a very effective way to organize our military efforts. One of the issues that has been mentioned several times, Secretary Shanahan, is the sense that, well, now we're unifying our entire effort in space on the Space Corps, but actually we have the National Reconnaissance Office, which has a great role in space, and we also have military intelligence programs that have roles in space, and they're outside this proposal. and there's, in fact, there's no, at this point, explicit sort of linkage to them other than informal communication. So are we missing something here? I think, again, the intent that we suggested in our in setting up the Unified Command would be an agency that had all services focused on space and with active participation. Maybe one good analogy would be Cyber Command, active participation with the civilian agencies that are in that realm too. Can you comment?
Sure. The bias in the proposal is towards speed. The proposal we submit really represents the stakeholders that we have control of. Early discussions were with the NRO, and I continue to have discussions with Sue Gordon, principally at the technical level as we start to evolve these new architectures so that we can provision at one point in time to do the integration. Technically, I think we'll be aligned from the start. The challenge organizationally, and I think when we look at the many stakeholders, there's real work to be done there to negotiate. So we thought of it as a multi-step process that eventually there would be more alignment and integration, but not in the first phase.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Shanahan, if I could just follow up on the NRO a little bit. Are you saying that at the onset now of the Space Force, you didn't feel a need to have that included, but possibly down the line you would? Did I understand that correctly?
There is a need. It was an issue of timing. So if we could do it all concurrently, that would be ideal. I don't think we can move that quickly. So rather than delay, we said, this is what we can do immediately. Provision for that integration and realignment in time.
Will that affect the need to unify the national security space activities? Do you see that as possibly a detriment in trying to unify? We keep hearing about unification. Is obviously you don't think that will be a detriment.
Well, I'd rather do more sooner. I mean, this is really about how do we move out quick. The proposal we've put together is really a threat-driven proposal. So as quickly as we can get after the threat, we want to move. If we could do more, we'd like to do that. I think some of the organizational, this is really more about the equities of stakeholders. If we could, resolve some of those more quickly, we would, incorporate more.
Okay, thank you. Secretary Wilson and General Hyten, can you offer your views on the NRO and Space Force? Madam Secretary, if we could start with you, please.
Senator, the National Reconnaissance Office was a black program established, or secret program established between the Air Force and the CIA a long time ago. In 1992, its existence was acknowledged. But while it was a black program, it was headed by the Undersecretary of the Air Force, who was simultaneously the head of the NRO. That ended in 1992, and the NRO had its own director who was not the Undersecretary of the Air Force. There remains a very deep connection between the Air Force and the NRO. About 40% of the people in the NRO are airmen. The rest are civilians or CIA employees. So there is a deep organic connection there, and we have deepened the already close connection between military space and space elements of the intelligence community over the last several years. And that's because many of the things we'll have to protect are actually NRO assets. So deepening that connection is important. It may not require actual structural change in the organizational chart. We'd be happy to work with you on kinds of things that might continue to deepen that already very close connection between the Air Force and the NRO.
Thank you. General Hyten, do you have anything to add?
Yes, ma'am, just a couple things. I think, first of all, we should recognize that right now the partnership between the National Reconnaissance Office and the Air Force is as strong as it's ever been. And I've been working with the National Reconnaissance Office for well over 30 years, and it's very strong. The second piece is that there's no doubt that the Space Force of the future will have to have a very strong relationship with the National Reconnaissance Office. The administration recognized this in Space Policy Directive 4. They gave us 180 days, which I think is out to the middle of August, to come back with a report that said this is how we would partner with the National Reconnaissance Office and the broader intelligence community in the future. I hope we can do that faster than August, because that partnership is very important to the future.
Okay, thank you. General Dunford, there's a tension between the desire for a streamlined effort, unified under one roof, and the desire for a joint integrated approach here. This was Admiral Rogers' concern and the reason he actually opposed the creation of a separate force for cyber. In our attempt to unify space activities, are we running the risk of creating another silo here, and we're going to surround it with a silo and we're going to distance it from other services? And how do we make sure that space is going to remain integrated?
Thanks, Senator. You know, Senator, in my assignment, what I've kind of come to learn is that the real strength of jointness is actually diversity of perspective brought by different services and organizations. But what's key is to leverage that diversity of perspective in processes that make sure we have coherent force development, force design, command and control, and planning. And I think those three areas are how we bring the joint team together. But I'm not at all concerned about a silo of space. The key is to have individuals that are singly focused on space and make sure we incorporate that perspective, that very healthy perspective, into the outcome, which is a joint force that can fight.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you. In Maine, there are certain basic principles of life. One is you don't drive on the ice after April 15th. Second is you hate the Yankees. And third is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. My impression is you all are doing a good job. We are getting the data that we need. We're getting the support from the Air Force. We're working together with the NRO and other agencies. And as I think many of you or all of you have testified, we're dominant in space right now. I understand the threat, and I understand our adversaries are moving forward, but I don't understand how adding a box to an organizational chart is going to give us some kind of qualitative military edge, to use a term that we've heard in this committee. General Hyten, I'm like the chairman. I'm genuinely undecided, although, as you can tell, I'm skeptical. I don't think it's broken. I think you're doing a good job. Why are we going to fix it?
So, Senator, I think we have been doing a good job. But we've been doing a good job in an environment where space has not been contested. What is changing is we have adversaries that are building significant capabilities that can challenge us in space.
I understand that, but I don't understand how putting a new box in an organizational chart is going to help us to respond to the new challenge that we face.
Well, there's two problems we have to fix. One, we have to have a commander focused on it all the time from an operational perspective. That's the Space Command issue we talked about.
And I agree. I think that's the answer, frankly.
And the second piece, Senator, is we have to have somebody in the Pentagon that focuses their total attention on space all the time. I've known every chief of staff of the Air Force for the last 20 or 30 years, and they've all carried space effectively into the tank. They've all cared about space. But it is a secondary issue, and as they've cared about space in the tank, the Pentagon has built a structure around them with dozens and dozens of people and organizations that are all in charge of space in many ways. I had one chief of staff tell me, well, I won't share the exact words that he told me, but it was very difficult to walk around the Pentagon and not bump into somebody who said they were in charge of space. So the goal is to put one person in charge of space, a four-star chief of staff that thought about it every time.
I understand that too, but one of the problems with this proposal is it doesn't put one person in charge of space, because we've got NRO, we've got NASA, we've got the private sector, which is very active in space. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that NRO and those other agencies, NGA, should be absorbed into this. That's the last thing I want to propose. But again, if the argument is we need a centralized authority, we don't have it here. And the other piece that I don't understand is we talk about a space force. That implies people. Nobody's going to go up and fight in space. We're not talking about soldiers here. We're talking about acquisition, design, and placement of hardware. And that's an important function, but I just don't understand why this has to be in a particular special box. I think Space Command makes sense. I understand that. But to create a new bureaucracy that's going to cost us $500 million a year, I've got to be convinced that there's some incremental value there. Mr. Secretary, you want to tackle that?
I'd love to. Thank you. If the environment were going to be the same as it is today going forward, I'd say don't fix it. I've studied this problem for 18 months, so it's not as though someone passed me a report. I've spent a lot of time on this subject, and the focus has been what is changing, and do we have the capacity and the ability to make that change? And when I break the problem down, the first is how do we set up Space Command so we have operations that now can compete in a contested environment? So that was, one problem, and you need a dedicated leader whose attention is that.
But isn't that the combatant commander of the Space Command?
Correct. So that's one. Then the second piece, and this is where I think you were headed, is why does that new box called the Space Force create a lot of value? There's two major changes that we have to get after. One is, how do we professionalize the generation of this cadre of space specialists? Today, it isn't a formal training and development program, a recruiting program.
But again, couldn't that take place in the context of the Space Command? It's a combatant command. It's going to have personnel and mission.
It could, and this is what the Space Force is intended: man, train, and equip like the other services. The equipping part is the other major component here. So as we look to modernize across the department, and this is an area where the department has struggled over time, and this is the most significant modernization in 30 years. Do we have the bandwidth and capacity, the focus, and the accountability to drive that? And that's what this really gets after, so that when we do modernize, we execute to the schedule, we execute to the budget, but more importantly, we deliver the technical capability at a department whole, not by service.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Cotton.
Thank you for your appearance today and for your work on this very important problem. I want to share the sentiments of several members of this committee to say that space is unfortunately now a contested domain, and our enemies are putting weapons in space and they're targeting our assets in space, and that we don't really get a choice to whether we want to fight in space. We only get a choice of whether we want to win or lose in space. I know you've all put a lot of effort into thinking through that problem, as do the members of this committee. I think you'll see it's not really a partisan matter either. But it's a major question, and I think we're all committed to getting it right, not getting it fast. I do want to continue on the line of questioning that Senator King started, and I want to start with your perspective on this, General Hyten, as a combatant commander. You said, rightly so, that space can never be more than your third priority, given your priorities of our nuclear strategic forces. You can imagine a world in which those nuclear strategic forces would have been their own service, where we would have put our missiles and our ballistic missile submarines and our strategic bombers, in addition to our command and control functions, into a separate nuclear forces, if you will. We didn't do that. We have strategic command to do that. Can you explain why we need to put all space assets, space forces into a separate service as opposed to a combatant command?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Senator. When you look back at the history of our nuclear forces, the three basic capabilities are the submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the ICBMs, and the bombers. And if you look at how those systems operate, the submarine clearly operates in the maritime domain. The bombers and the ICBMs operate in the air domain. And so the expertise you need to operate those weapon systems come from the domain expertise you achieve from the Air Force and from the Navy. When you look at the space capabilities that we operate, satellites, rockets to get us into space, the capabilities there require expertise in the space domain. That's the difference between the legacy of Strategic Command, which then took domain-focused capabilities and put it together into one unified command, and a Space Force that will take another domain capability together and put it into another unified command.
Those capabilities, though, I mean, to me, they do seem pretty Air Force-centric. They don't, I mean, I understand, and I see General Dunford looking at me, that the Marine Corps and the Army uses space assets a lot to fight. It's critical to our way of fighting. But, you know, unless, as Senator King said, we're going to have a large number of actual soldiers in space fighting, and they need a different set of skills. This is primarily going to be about technology and acquisitions and so forth. So I think what a lot of us on the committee are trying to figure out is what's the incremental advantage of having a separate Space Force like the Marine Corps is to the Navy within the Air Force, as opposed to, say, the Air Force having the training and equipping function that the 5 services have for combatant command like yours, or for the geographical commands and, you know, the Central Command or European Command or so forth. Secretary Wilson, that may be a question for you to take.
Thank you, Senator. I would just add one thing to what General Hyten mentioned, which is the importance of the development of space professionals. And I think that that's an important thing for the committee to consider, particularly the potential advantage of separating out promotions for Space Force members, and particularly Space Force operators, that would be a benefit, to be able to promote to need, rather than just take the chance that you will get the right numbers of people. That's particularly important for small career fields. And I also think that the continuing to strengthen professional development around space and space warfighting is important. Obviously, we're moving forward with this irrespective of what decision is made by the Congress and administration on formal structures. But the shift to warfighting, things like we've established the Schriever Scholars this year, which is a specific area of professional military education on space, opening undergraduate space training to allies, going to 4 months on the floor operating systems to 4 months of training in combat operations for our space operators. So that shift of a culture to warfighting and professional development is actually, it's an important element for your consideration.
Secretary Shanahan, I see you reaching for your button. You can respond if you'd like. I had one question for General Dunford before the chairman gavels me down, but if you'd like to respond.
You know, part of this, and I'm hoping this gets conveyed today, 5 years from now is going to look much different. And I think sometimes we look through the lens of today and we extrapolate going forward, but, you know, there's going to be literally an explosion of thousands of satellites. So you think of just the growth in space. You think about this contested environment, and then how quickly we need to be able to adapt commercial innovation. And then, you know, the Army's going to modernize their C2 system, the Navy's going to modernize their C2 system. We have all this modernization going on concurrently. So how do we organize ourselves to be able to accomplish this amount of change in an environment that's getting, you know, increasingly dangerous? That's really what we've tried to do here, so we could dedicate the skill and the resources to be able to move quickly instead of bureaucratically trying to organize ourselves across so many different organizations.
General Dunford, you look like you're about to push your button. Do you want to? Well, I think the chairman's going to gavel me down. I will say this, though, before my time expires. Bob Gates, who I think is one of the finest secretaries of defense that we've had, wrote in his most recent book, Passion for Leadership, that normally when you face a bureaucratic challenge, moving boxes around is not the right solution. That doesn't mean it's the wrong solution here, but he said that normally what you need is a cultural change from your leadership. Whatever happens in this year's National Defense Authorization Act, I want to commend you, Secretary Shanahan, General Dunford, Secretary Wilson, General Hyten, for the cultural change you've driven inside the department to recognize that we need to significantly increase the level of our capabilities in space, given what we face in Russia and China, because your leadership on this has been very strong. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all of your testimony today. I just want to concur with what I'm hearing from my colleagues. I don't think there's any disagreement from folks in this committee that space is something that we need to focus a great deal on, that it is now a contested domain in ways that simply didn't exist in the past, and we need to do a better job of coordinating and integrating space into our overall defense strategy. But I think our question is that this approach that we're looking at is just going to add a whole lot more cost. At a time when the Department of Defense needs to be a whole lot more nimble, has to be a whole lot more innovative, and has to be able to do more with less, because we can't just keep throwing money after dollars when there's so many other needs that we have in our economy here. that I would like to have folks coming to the committee saying, we can do this and we can do it more efficiently and we can have more lethality and we'll be able to defend American interest and do it in a cost-effective way. And I'm not hearing that. And Secretary Wilson, I'm going to, I hate doing this, but I think it's important because I think you said this best of anyone. In 2017, after a meeting with the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee talking about the Space Force, you said, quote, "The Pentagon is complicated enough. This will make it more complex, add more boxes to the organization chart, and cost more money. If I had more money, I would put it into lethality, not bureaucracy." Secretary Wilson, I think that's profound. I agree. The Air Force Chief of Staff went a step further and stated, quote, "If you're saying the word separate and space in the same sentence, I would offer you're moving in the wrong direction. That's why the Secretary and I are focused on how we integrate space. Every mission that we perform in the U.S. military is dependent on space. Now is not the time to build seams and segregate and separate. It's time to integrate." And I couldn't agree more with those statements. I haven't heard any kind of refuting those very strong statements. And if I think about the growth of bureaucracy, all we have to do is look at the past of agencies. And inevitably, folks come and say, we're going to do this efficiently and it's going to be different this time. I'm the ranking member on Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, which, of course, oversees the Department of Homeland Security. And when we stood up that department, I mean, just look at what has happened in that department over the years. Since 2005, the DHS's Department Management Operations staff responsible for functions including legislative affairs, public affairs, general counsel, has grown at a very large rate. What started at 723 employees now is close to 2,600 employees. Bureaucratic organizations always grow. I've never seen a bureaucratic organization that actually shrinks, and this one is particularly rank-heavy, which is usually has its own bureaucracy that comes as ranks increase. And essentially, the proposal would have 2 4-star generals and an undersecretary in charge of the organization the size of a Marine Expeditionary Brigade, which is usually commanded, as you know, General Dunford, by a brigadier general who is conducting operations in both the air and land domains, very complex, contested environments. And we're going to be adding an incredible number of folks in what is being done efficiently in other places around the Department of Defense now. So my question is, what would happen to the end strength of the existing services if personnel are transferred to the Space Force? Would the Air Force, Navy, and Army backfill those positions, or are we looking to reduce the end strengths of those forces as we create this new bureaucracy? Secretary Shanahan?
No, we would not backfill the end strength. So
So-
this would be net zero.
So we would see a reduction
When,
in those other areas because
yes,
we're
yes,
moving.
Yes.
I also, we talked about, and Senator Reid brought it up, which I think is important, is the jointness factor. And that certainly was one of the important and I think paramount achievements of Goldwater Nichols, to make sure that we're fighting jointly. And that's why I concur with some of the comments I've heard from my colleagues on having the joint command structure. But if the creation of the Space Force is approved and we consolidate all of the service space equities into one branch, the unified U.S. Space Command will only have one service as a force provider, is my understanding. General Dunford, how does this proposal fit into Goldwater Nichols, and how do you propose senior officers in the Space Force would broaden and gain joint experience if we're consolidating all space equities into a single service providing force for a single functional combatant command?
No, Senator, I think it's a great question. And for clarity, I would envision that each of the services would still have expertise at the staff planning level to employ space capabilities, and then also the necessary tools to take advantage of space. So ground systems, staff planners, and those kind of things would be in the other services. But Senator, from where I sit now, particularly as a former Joint Force Commander operational, and as the chairman, I mentioned a minute ago, the diversity of perspective actually brings strength to the joint force. So I don't have concerns about Space Command being a cylinder of excellence, if you will, because it's largely a single service. I think it's imperative on the joint force to make sure that in force development, force design, in command and control, and our planning, we leverage that diversity that each of the services brings. My perspective is, and I was probably where many members of the committee are today, 2 years ago, skeptical that we're moving in the right direction. And at the end of the day, I asked the question, we have a space domain now. It is a warfighting domain. What is the optimal organizational construct to make sure that we're positioned to fight in space. And that's where I've landed now on the Space Force. And so I do believe that the framework within which we develop joint capabilities will allow us to leverage both Space Command, the operational element here, as well as Space Force, the train, organize, and equip organization.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me just say to all of you, thank you for your service to our country. I most certainly appreciate all of the expertise that you provide. And once again, Secretary Wilson, it has been truly an honor and a privilege to be able to work with you, and we're going to miss you. I have to share with you all, I guess I'm open-minded as to whether or not this is a good idea or not. And at the same time, I think all of us have an obligation to come in a sense, to be skeptical, because what we have right now appears to, as you've all indicated, we have the best with regards to our approach right now to space compared to our near-peer competitors. And so what we're trying to do is to make improvements for the long term based upon the issues that we see that we're not able to do as well as we would like to. I see the Air Force, though, in many ways, having learned a lot from previous projects and so forth. The Air Force right now has a B-21 project, which is not only on time, it's on budget. It would appear to me that there are acquisition processes within the Air Force right now that are showing improvement, that we're actually seeing that work its way through. And I'm wondering what it is within the space processes that would be different, and why it is that space is a challenge. I'm also trying to figure out what happens when we start talking about this new bureaucracy. We've actually considered the fact that we want to, if I'm understanding this, that we would actually have a general officer, a chief of staff who would be a 4-star, responsible for the Space Force, but we would also have another individual who would serve as commander of the U.S. Space Command. Let me just start with this. Any possibility that we could follow the same guidelines as we found within Cybercom, where we have a dual-hatted position? Has that been considered as one way to perhaps promote some efficiencies in this proposal? I'll start with Secretary Shanahan, and if you'd like to pass that off, you're welcome to, sir.
No, let me start there and add on to your comments about the B-21. The first is, let's say we did have the dual hat, and you just look at the work that individual would be accountable to deliver. It's too much work. When I just look at it, and if it was General Raymond, it would be too much work given what's taking place across the department. So it's just a bandwidth. I would offer, if we were to compare acquisition processes to the B-21, in our situation, we have the opportunity to take advantage of innovation that's taking place in the commercial sector. And the B-21 is really, indigenous. We're going to have to make changes to our acquisition processes in order to be able to take advantage of all of this new technology and innovation.
Would not a Space Force have the same unfortunate bureaucratic problems that the Air Force has to deal with today?
That was the nature of the Space Development Agency. Carve the development portion out so that we can address the bureaucratic red tape of acquisition, so we can really leverage the commercial innovation, and the fact that how we design is going to be fundamentally different because it's now a contested environment.
This wouldn't be the first time that we made a change like this. I mean, this has gone through processes in the past. There is no such thing as a perfect layout. Mm-hmm. The one we have today is clearly not perfect. Mm-hmm. It could be improved upon. And General Dunford, I see that you were looking over as though you may have something to add to that particular thought.
Senator, do you mind if I address the dual hat issue?
Yes, sir.
So
go ahead.
When I look at General Nakasone, the benefit of the dual hat arrangement up there is he's able to combine intelligence with cyber capabilities to quickly execute operations. And we saw, combined with authorities, the benefit and the power of that last fall in protecting our democracy. In the case of Space Command and Space Force, Space Command will be singularly focused on integrating the joint force for operations, so integrating capabilities and integrating across capabilities to conduct operations. The four-star with Space Force really is in a train, organized, and equipped world, and I see the benefit of having somebody singularly focused on developing the human capital, the doctrine, the capabilities, and the culture of a Space Force. But that same individual, I don't believe, can also be the one we count on day-to-day to conduct operations.
Let me just ask a couple of real quick questions. General Hyten, I'm going to come right to you with this because clearly you have a number of these items under your responsibility right now, but let me just run this by. And satellites are going to be separate right now in terms of maintaining the NRO separate, number one. Number two, what about hypersonics? Whose role is this going to play, and how does that fit into this whole process? Are we going to find that under a Space Force or a Space Command, or is that going to remain separated out?
Well, you'll organize the structure of the weapons that we're building and the capabilities that we're building based on the organization with the best expertise. I think the Space Force structure will likely build the sensors that will see hypersonics, but I think the other services will more likely build the hypersonic capabilities because they will operate in their domains. The hypersonic capabilities we're talking about right now are not space capabilities. They operate from the sea, from the land, from the air, through the air, and so that structure makes sense to go through there. If I could just build on a little bit to the previous discussion, though, because I think it's important for the committee to understand that, well, just look at the uniform I'm wearing. I am an airman at heart. When I bleed blue. I love my Air Force, and I love the history of the Air Force in space. I mean, the term aerospace was created at this committee in 1958 by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force to talk about the integration of air and space. I love that background, but every physical domain we have, when it becomes contested, we create a military service to deal with that. So we're going to have a Space Force someday. I think what the committee has to decide is when is that going to happen? And I think now is the time to go to what Chairman said. You want to get ahead of the problem, not trail it, not come in the response to a catastrophe, get ahead of the problem. But I hope everybody understands I love the uniform that I wear.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. I think you can understand, or I hope you can understand, that while this committee seems to be open to this idea, we're still seeing a lot of generalities after being studied for a while, and we're having a hard time grasping. Candidly, unlike some colleagues, my needle may be a little bit more inclined to create a Space Force, but I'm still got questions. For instance, Secretary Shanahan and General Dunford, there was a statement that you issued that said, current service-specific entities that provide global space capabilities would become part of the U.S. Space Force. For example, the Air Force Space and Missile Systems Center, the Navy Mobile User Objective System, and the Army's operations of wide and narrow band global satellite communications all become part of the Space Force. But then you go on to say, as necessary, DoD components would retain organic space capabilities uniquely required to support the core mission of that military service or defense agency. So what exactly would and wouldn't become part of the Space Force? I mean, do you have a list of the entities that would have, and do we have that list, or can you get that list to us? Go ahead, General.
Senator, I can start and just give you an example. In my own service, the Marine Corps, we don't have space capabilities in the Marine Corps. We do have personnel that are trained in capabilities to take advantage of space. And so where I see us going is that the preponderance of space capability would be in that single service, the Space Force. But each of the services, because space is integral to their warfighting capability, is going to have to have expertise inside those services to make sure that space is properly integrated into their warfighting capability. And then they're going to have some capabilities to take advantage of space, ground systems and so forth. But this would move, you know, on order of 95% plus of the capabilities in the Department of Space into a single force. So that what would be residual in the other services would be minimal, and it would be designed specifically and only to make sure they can take advantage of space.
Okay. Secretary, you want to add anything to that?
No, absolutely. Senator, if we can come brief you. We've done the architectural and programmatic analysis, service and agency over the FIDP. So I could show you where today we have 10 different organizations working on similar architectures. This is really not about the systems that we have in place. Wholesale, they stay in place, but the department is about to embark on command and control, new command and control for all the services. We have an opportunity here to have all domain command and control at the Department of Defense level. That's never been an opportunity. And why that's such a big deal, and that's what the Space Development Agency represents, is we're going to have a common ground stations, common terminals, the infrastructure that's necessary to really be able to strip out cost and be able to upgrade capability. We'll finally have a baseline that allow us to do it. And I think this is where Senator Peters was. Where does the value come from? 10 efforts to 1. There's real cost, real schedule, real capability that gets delivered in a much more effective fashion. That's what this proposal is about. I'd trade 500 people in a heartbeat to implement this proposal. If that's where the negotiation is, I think we have a winner here. The real benefit is delivering capability at a much lower cost, and those dollars are in the billions.
All right, on a specific, just to bring it home to Alabama, is the Army Space and Missile Defense Command at Redstone Arsenal going to be part of the Space Force? Do you know?
Well,
or do you want to get back to me?
No, I actually, it depends which part, because so when we think of SMDC, some of the critical roles in the SMDC, some of that will be aligned with the Space Force as we do Army modernization. Some of the existing resources that support ongoing, I call them legacy Army operations, they'll stay in their current capacity and their current alignment.
All right. Secretary Wilson, I just kind of want to ask it in a different way, this question about the need for this. Because I've read statements of yours in the past where you have talked about the need for a Space Command versus Space Force, maybe not both. Let's put aside the fact, and I get it about acquisition. I see that, but I sometimes think that could be done within the Air Force. But let me just put it this way. Had the President of the United States not issued an order about creating this, and you have been the Secretary now for a couple of years, would this be something that you would be coming to the Senate Armed Services Committee recommending after having served 2 years as Secretary of the Air Force?
Senator, I think the President of the United States has done us a service by elevating this conversation and making the challenge we face in space a kitchen table conversation. And when I came here to be confirmed in front of you 2 years ago, I was told by a holdover from the previous administration, by the folks who were still kind of in the previous administration or holding over or whatnot, that I had to take out the words space and warfighting in the same sentence. And look at where we are today. The President has proposed, and you all have supported, 2 consecutive years of double-digit percentage increases in the space budget, and there's another one before you today in the FY20 budget. And we're having a hearing on how America needs to dominate in space. And I think we need to give him credit for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that answer, Secretary Wilson.
Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all of our witnesses today for being here. This is obviously very important to all of us, but making sure that the structure is right is also very important. I think we've determined that it's a necessity. It's just how we establish the forces. So I hope we can get this sorted out. I'm going to I know we've talked about this so many times over in so many different ways. We've given a lot of different examples of different types of structures of organizations within our military. I guess we need some convincing that there is a necessity for a 6th branch within our armed services. We do have United States Special Operations Command, SOCOM, and its components. They were stood up to organize, train, and equip our nation's special operators, and they were established to address a gap in our warfighting construct without standing up a separate branch of service. So with that, we have Naval Special Warfare, we have MARSOC, we have USASOC, and we've got AVSOC. All of our branches represented within SOCOM. So why is that not a great example then of what we could do for a space command instead of a space force? Could somebody address that?
I'd be happy to do that. Let me just start with, in my previous life, I did weapon system development for SOCOM, and I've done weapon systems development for space, and then also the Missile Defense Agency. So a full spectrum of different classes of engineering and different levels of complexity. The SOCOM model is very much different than what we're proposing, and that's what you're recognizing. In the SOCOM model, the very advanced engineering is actually done by the service. And in this model, it would be the same. So the advanced capability would be done by the Space Force. So there's similarity. The actual research and development that's done by SOCOM today, so today if we just looked at the budget, is about $600 million. If we look at what's in the Air Force today, it's about 11. I'm thinking it's 11 billion in acquisitions, about 8 billion in RDT&E. It's a different scale, and the complexity of the engineering and the complication is just a different class. So I would just argue it's different missions and different scales, and I think it would be much more difficult to manage in that environment given the amount of acquisition we're going to do as a department going forward.
I understand the acquisition challenges. I would say that right now as well, we also have challenges with personnel simply to move into a space force and what those requirements might be. And Secretary, I know we had spoken just several weeks ago about maybe some of the challenges, because anytime we do stand up, even if it's a brand new unit just somewhere, you know, whether it's a company or a battalion, I mean, you're trying to field new positions. And could you address for me the challenges with pulling a lot of talent, primarily from our Air Force, but also from some of our other service branches, and the implications of what that might do to hollow out some of the other forces with that talent, and just some of the challenges we'll face in filling some of those top-heavy slots? Secretary, can you address that maybe?
Senator, with respect to the people, I think the part of this has to do with at what time scale. How do we develop our people? And then how do we gradually promote them and get them ready to take on positions of responsibility? I think you've identified one of the issues that will be one of the hard parts we're dealing with in the working group, the task force that's been set up under a two-star general to look at how do we make sure we have the right expertise, and on what time scale could that Space Force grow into a fully robust support for a member of the Joint Chiefs.
So as we're looking, and again, understanding that these are decisions that will be made along the way, but what kind of timeline will it take to fully establish a Space Force rather than a Space Command?
Senator, the concept that is in the draft working group paper that was finished by the end of March and is currently being refined is that within 90 days of passage of legislation, we would stand up the cell of a Space Force staff inside the Air Force, and then it will move on to two other phases, one to initial operating capability and then full operating capability. Though each of those phases are conditions-based, but the concept is that it would be fully operational sometime in the window of 2023, 2024 timeframe.
Okay, that sounds very fast, actually, to stand up a whole separate branch of service, but it is something that we'll continue to look at as Congress. I appreciate the input that you've all provided here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. I have appreciated my colleagues' questioning. I think they've addressed a lot of the questions I have, and I want to take it in a different direction. I would say take it to 30,000 feet. We're talking about a Space Force, so I should probably call it a low Earth orbit, and talk about problems in space and how we're going to deal with them. And maybe if we talk about problems, then we could work backward to structure. So here's a recent one that I was interested in. Just in the last couple weeks, March 27th, India announced that it had successfully conducted a test of an anti-satellite weapon. So they had something in low Earth orbit. They used an anti-satellite weapon to knock it down. And it resulted in, the estimates right now, 400 pieces of debris, 24 of which are large enough to potentially pose a threat to the International Space Station. There have been other instances like this. There was a Chinese similar effort in 2007 that led to the cataloged 100,000 pieces of debris, many of which are still observing in debris fields that pose danger to other assets in space. There was a collision in '09 between a working U.S. satellite and a sort of defunct Soviet-era satellite, that kind of a fender bender that produced debris. And then this debris causes challenges. If we think that space is going to be more of a traffic jam, more satellites for all kinds of purposes up there, what should we be thinking about as a Senate in this committee or in foreign relations about sort of the rules? What should the rules environment be, and what should we be doing to try to promote rules? India is an ally. We're not talking about an adversary doing something. We're talking about them testing some capacity, but then that creates challenges for all kinds of uses of space. How should we be solving problems like that? General Hyten, you look like you wanted to jump in.
So, Senator Kane, I think the first lesson from the Indian ASAT is just a simple question of why did they do that? And the answer should be simple, I think, to all the committee looking at it, is that they did that because they're concerned about threats to their nation from space. And therefore, they feel they have to have a capability to defend themselves in space.
And can I just interrupt for a second? And I think they have a second concern as well, that there's no rules right now. There may one day be rules, and often when we write rules about this, we benefit those who already have the technology and say, okay, you already have it, we'll establish rules for you, but then we usually establish non-proliferation rules for everybody who doesn't. So if they're concerned about the weaponization of space, they want to be able to get in there first, so that if the rules are created, they're sort of grandfathered in. I think that's part of the issue.
Well, the second issue, from my perspective, is that I've advocated for a long time for the development of some kind of international norms of behavior in space, and where those norms of behavior should begin, from my opinion, is with debris. Because I don't want, as the combatant commander responsible for space today, I don't want more debris.
Yeah.
But we don't have any international conditions that say that that's not a good thing.
And you would think that even our adversaries would have the same concern about the debris effect on their program, so that should be something where there could be some international common ground and ability to find rules of the road.
And I think that's how it should be worked, in an international perspective, to start walking down that path to make sure that space can be used for future generations. Because if we keep creating debris in space, eventually we're going to get to the point where it's very difficult to find a place to launch, very difficult to find a place to put a satellite, to operate a satellite without having to maneuver all the time to keep it away from debris. All those kind of things are very complicated, but it has to be worked in an international perspective. And I hope we get there.
What is the international forum, or what is the international group that could do something like this?
I'll continue, Senator Kane. The place where that's debated now is in the United Nations and a Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. That's where that is debated mostly. And the United Nations is a good place, but I would like to think the United States could take a leadership role in that, working with our allies to define what we believe is the proper norms of behavior in space, and then bring that into the broader international community. It's very difficult if you try to work something like this in the broad context, and that's clearly a State Department-led function. Others in the government will lead that, but from a military perspective, it's important, I think, that we have those structures.
I mean, there is some concern that adversaries create debris intentionally, too. If they create debris fields, that can then, prohibit access to portions of space. One of the most scintillating federal publications is NASA's Debris Quarterly, but NASA has an office whose job is to monitor debris so that those of us putting up satellites so we can get Sirius in our car are not going to be affected by that. I mean, so this is an issue that really needs some rules. I think, Secretary Shanahan, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to maybe add on to your comment when you said, what are some of the areas that we should be spending more time as a committee or a body? Space is clearly one. Cyber is another one of those domains that needs a better rule set. You know, AI and autonomy, all these new technologies are going to unlock enormous, you know, very positive capabilities, but there's also a downside, and we need to really be investing time to think about those so we can, to the earlier point, set some rules or establish some norms so that someone doesn't take an advantage or, you know, leverage.
I hope we will play a leadership role in that. I think treaties have kind of gone out of fashion in the Senate. We don't ratify treaties much anymore, but treaties are necessary. I mean, the notion that we could just have our own set of rules and a treaty is a bad thing because it involves some incursion into sovereignty. If we don't have some rules about space, it's going to affect our ability. We create a Space Force like that, and it's perfect, but we find a lot of the domain is a domain that we really can't adequately invest in because of debris fields or other things. It's going to be to our detriment. Very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the witnesses testifying today. I also appreciate from the President and the Secretary and Chairman the $750 billion DOD request. I hope we can move on that and you know, appreciate the President putting this idea forward. You can tell that we're all wrestling with it. We're kind of struggling with it. To be honest, it's pretty clear that watching some of your evolutions that you've struggled with it as well and wrestled with it, and I think that's okay. That's what this committee is supposed to be trying to address. General Dunford, your statement on the fact that reform usually comes after some kind of disaster, and we can try to be preemptive or in front of this, actually, I think is a very powerful one. And General Hyten, I think what you're talking about, saying this is going to happen at some time in the future, I think you're probably right about that. My questions actually relate to this issue of timing. And let me give you a concern that I have. It relates to readiness of the entire force. So I commend all of you and everybody else at the Pentagon for working on this readiness. A lot of people forget 2010 to 2016, the Department of Defense budget was cut by 25%, an amount that was almost close to $540 billion, which is an entire DOD budget year. And we all know that readiness plummeted. I chair the subcommittee on readiness, and I've held numerous hearings in readiness in the force plummeted, period. And what we've all been trying to do, and I commend you and the President and everybody else in this committee and the Chairman, Ranking Member, is get the readiness of our 5 current services back up to the level that the American people expect from all of us and from all of you. That is a hugely important mission. And here's been one of my overriding concerns with regard to the Space Force. Not that it is not important, not that it might not even be a good idea, but I'm concerned that is it prudent to take on what would be a fairly disruptive element of a new aspect of the services in the United States military when the current 5 services, let's face it, are not up to the level of readiness that they need to be. Do any of you think that we are at the level of readiness that we should be right now? General Dunford?
General, I'll start. No, and as you know,
So isn't that a concern then? I mean, I know you think we can walk and chew gum, but shouldn't we try to get to the level of readiness that we all really think we need? And then
let me tell you how I think about this. I don't look at it's either space or readiness. I actually look at making sure that we have a singular focus on the interdependencies of the joint force on space as a readiness issue. We can generate all of the squadron and battalion readiness we want, and if we're not capable of defending ourselves in space and taking full advantage of space from a command and control and intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance perspective, precision munitions, timing of our systems, if we can't take full advantage of that and we can't protect ourselves in space, battalion and squadron readiness will amount to naught. And so I view this issue actually from my perspective, which is why my evolution on the issue has taken the direction it has, is I actually now have come to much better appreciate as a result of our analytic work the interdependencies on space and the fact that this whole issue of Space Force really is, in my judgment, related to readiness.
So in your professional judgment, which I respect immensely, you do not think this is going to take away what I believe is the most important mission everybody here should be doing, is getting our 5 current services back up to the readiness that are demanded by the American people.
This is, in my judgment, a joint war, whatever direction the committee decides to go, this should be addressed as a joint warfighting readiness issue. That's what it is. It's not an organizational issue. It's a joint warfighting readiness issue.
Let me be a little bit more specific as it relates to a readiness concern. This committee and all of you have made, all of us together, significant progress with regard to building up our nation's missile defense. And Mr. Secretary, you recently said in testimony that was vital. I agree with that. I think the whole committee does. It's been very bipartisan. One of the elements, General Hyten, you have mentioned that's actually critical to our nation's missile defense is having and deploying as soon as possible space-based sensors that can look at both hypersonics and the ballistic missile threats coming to our nation. I think it's your number one unfunded requirement that you've mentioned that. Again, I think the committee agrees that that's critical. My understanding is that the space sensor layer system is being shifted from MDA, the Missile Defense Agency, to the Space Development Agency, which hasn't even been stood up yet. General Hyten, doesn't something like that almost automatically, in your mind, indicate that we're going to have a delay in deploying a space-based sensor system, which you and others and we all agree is critical to missile defense, when you're taking it out of the Missile Defense Agency into a new agency that hasn't even been stood up yet? How can that help with regard to readiness on missile defense? I'm very concerned about that topic.
So I think there's a number of interesting observations. I would say that the secretaries to my right will probably have an interesting perspective on where they live. Where I live as a combatant commander, I have a requirement for a space sensor layer that will see the threats that will enable our deterrent and enable our defense.
How quickly can we deploy that?
That's the question, and we need that by the mid-2020s. That's what the threat requirements are showing us, and therefore we have to go fast in order to do that. I've testified in front of this committee before for that issue. We've pushed that. There's so many people that are involved in space now, it makes it difficult. So it was going to be SMC, then the Missile Defense Agency. The Space Development Agency is focused on that. The structure that needs to be, and the Space Development Agency is supposed to look at evolutionary, or revolutionary, not evolutionary concepts. This is a good place for them to do that. They have the right ability to go fast. But the key from a combatant commander perspective is that's my requirement. I need that requirement, and we need it filled by the middle of the next decade.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I understand it, under its current organization, the Air Force does not have a good track record of being able to effectively manage the prioritization of its missions in both air and space. And so space frequently falls to a lower priority or lacks a consistent seat at the table. I contrast this with the U.S. Navy, which has successfully managed to prioritize its own air, surface, and submarine missions to include the establishment of separate training, acquisitions, and doctrinal development centers across these very different domains. Why has this been such a problem for the Air Force under its current structure, and what role does a new U.S. Space Command play in helping prioritize space across departments, and how does that differ or duplicate the intent of the proposed Space Force. Madam Secretary or General, do you want to address that?
Happy to. Senator, the biggest shift that we are seeing is the shift from an uncontested domain to a contested domain. Over the last 3 years, including the budget that you have before you, the president's budget has included double-digit percentage increases in the budget that are driven by an analysis of the threat, the strategy to meet that threat, the concepts of operations, and the programs to support it. So I think what you're seeing and the difference between what you described with the Navy is that the Navy has been operating in a contested domain for hundreds of years. The Air Force in space has been operating in a contested domain for a much shorter period of time. We have set up in the National Space Defense Center. We have schoolhouses and specific focus on space, most of which have been set up in the last decade. So you're seeing in the Air Force that focus. And I would also say that for the missions and the requirements of the combatant commander, the United States Air Force has provided what the combatant commanders needed in an uncontested environment. So, the Air Force built a glass house before the invention of stones. We now have the invention of stones, and as Jay Raymond said just yesterday to a very large audience, he said a year ago that the Air Force was in a 9G turn towards space superiority, and he was wrong. It's a 12G turn, and so I'm proud of the force that we're presenting.
So how will the U.S. Space Command help prioritize across departments, and will it, and how does that differ from intent or duplication in terms of the proposed Space Force? I mean, you got this very complex system. You're saying you're standing up a new training, and do you think you're capable, will be just as capable in the Air Force to doing multiple things at once the way the Navy can do it? So how does this differ between, Space Command and Space Force?
Senator, I was trying to explain why I thought the Navy structures were different from the way the Air Force evolved with respect to space. But in the proposal that's before you, one of the elements that's before you, in addition to, there's the additive personnel that's in the proposal. Some of it is to support the 4-star who will be a member of the Joint Chiefs. The other large number of people is to set up a training and doctrine center specifically focused on the challenges of space as a contested domain.
So then the Air Force will send your people to their training programs? Is that what you're saying, or how does that work?
That training and doctrine center would be primarily for members of the Space Force and other officers to get joint experience, and honestly also our allied officers. The Air Force has already opened up its Space 100, 200, and 300 programs to our allied officers, and we have opened up and created a combined Space Operations Center this last year that includes our allies in California.
Okay, thank you. I also serve in the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, so I want to talk a bit about the intersection of military and commercial space assets. As you're all aware, this is an area where we don't yet widely have accepted norms, and we've had that discussion here today already. The multi-pronged proposal we have here would likely increase complications even further. In the realm of great power competition, we see countries like China who are rapidly expanding their space presence, but they don't have issues of deconfliction because their military and commercial assets are intermingled and they operate almost as a single unit. So how does DOD and the proposed Space Force plan to work with other federal agencies and our commercial sector to deconflict with these issues before and while they are arising?
Sir, let me take that one on. The Space Development Agency, in its design, is intended to do undertake 4 different activities. The first is consolidation, so that we can take all the requirements of the department, and then to do fundamental systems engineering, so that we can take advantage of a space ecosystem. So everything from launch to sustainment, and then by design tap into the commercial space industry where significant innovation has occurred. But for us to actually be able to incorporate that technology, we have to accommodate or make corrections to our acquisition system. Our rules and regulations won't allow us to leverage that new innovation. And the Space Development Agency, which is modeled after the Missile Defense Agency, allows us to be able to take advantage of all of those things. And I think that's what allows us to be able to develop capability more quickly and at a lower cost.
But I'm also concerned about security, and how do you force the civilians to work closely with you in security and share information? You've got people selling tickets for tourism into space, for crying out loud. How do you deconflict that? Whereas the Chinese don't have these problems because they have total control over their commercial sector.
I mean, you know, we have procedures, protocols. We've worked with commercial segments. You know, we have a long history of doing that. That's really the intent of standing up an organization like this, so we can really leverage that commercial space.
I'd love to explore this further, but I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I want to talk more about organizational transition. I think the President was right to make this a target that we need to achieve. So to me, it's not a matter of whether we should do it, it's how we should do it and when we should do it. Secretary Shanahan or Secretary Wilson, a part of what I'm trying to do is when you stand up the force, a part of what you're doing is realigning current operations into a more cohesive unit. And so if you're looking at the end state of a space force, have you done the analysis to determine how much of that is just realigning existing commands, training and doctrine center? In other words, if I'm building a new enterprise, how much of the current enterprise is simply being realigned, and then what is the net new? And what I'm specifically talking about is the underlying cost associated with that, because in reality, you're not going to get a whole lot more money. And so you're going to have to build, you're going to have to create this force within current spending run rates for the most part. And so I'm trying to figure out, when General Hyten rightly suggests that there's a capability he needs by the mid-20s, what potentially shifts to the right after we've already quantified that net incremental cost just for the overall structure of a separate force?
Sir, the way we've been looking at this is how quickly can we respond to the threat? And then, you know, behind all this, how do we do it more effectively? Standing up the Space Command is not a incrementally large change in cost. So I would argue it's not really moving lines and boxes. It's eliminating overhead and competing priorities. So, you know, 100% of the time the Space Commander can focus on the new mission. It's not about just getting separation from STRATCOM. It's 100% focused on the new mission, which is contested space, and the authorities, the rules of engagement, the TTPs, and the technology to support that. The other piece of this was, and this is where the real value is created in the Space Development Agency, for incremental capability that we're going to deploy, given that, and I'll use Secretary Wilson's metaphor, given that we've been designing glass houses, how do we quickly transition so we're no longer building glass houses? That's the race. It's really not about reorganizing for people and professional development. We can pace that based on how much change and cost we want to absorb. But the race to get out of building glass houses is where we've looked at consolidation. How do we go from 10 people attempting to get out of that operation to 1, and then leveraging the infrastructure? Because we duplicate. And so,
right. I think this could represent an opportunity for driving out efficiencies, and come to find out that maybe there's a way to do this without any net incremental cost. But if you don't get that right, then you say the good news is we have a very clear vision for a Space Force. The bad news is we need net incremental money that we don't have today. And then the bad news we're likely to give you is we don't have any more money, so what are you not going to do? So that's really my focus. Secretary Wilson.
Just to add on here, 90% of the forces that we're talking about are currently in the Air Force. In the design phase that we're in with the task force that we have stood up that includes all of the services but is led by the Air Force by a 2-star general, we are in the design phase now, and one of the tasks in that design phase is to recommend the preliminary macro-organizational design of the U.S. Space Force field units as well as subordinate headquarters. So that planning work is underway.
Good. General Hyten, do you have anything to add to that?
I think it's just important to emphasize that the Space Force that is in our proposed legislation is under the Air Force.
Right.
So if the Space Force existed today, I would be sitting next to the Service Secretary responsible for space. That decision by the President and Vice President to put the Space Force under the Air Force was the big driver for me, because that will allow us to drive efficiencies and fix problems and not focus on what is the song, what is the recruiting structure, what is the personnel structure, what is the basing structure.
When I saw that proposal, I felt a lot more comfortable with the organizational concept. So, you know, that's why I said I don't think it's a matter, to the points that General Dunford made in his opening comments, I don't think it's a matter of whether or not we need this focus. It's just the organizational construct. And I think that what's been laid out to this point is a good one. The last thing I'll leave you with, because I want to end on time in deference to my colleagues, is that I still, while we're taking a look at this organizational evolution, I still think that we need a lot of work done on the overall organizational evolution of these operations that are now embedded within the service lines that we should really take a look at to drive efficiencies. Has nothing to do with the Space Command, but there's one best practice for acquisition. There's one best practice for a lot of these operations that are now siloed. And my guess is if you did that, you'd free up a lot of resources within the current spending levels that could actually be made to accelerate a lot of the things that I know are your top priorities. So that's something I look forward to speaking with y'all when we can do it on a more meaningful basis back over at the Pentagon. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for your service.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Senator Manchin's recognize Senator Reid presiding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you all again for being here, and I'm sorry I've been running back and forth to committee meetings. I do have a few. In the proposal, this could be to anybody that would want to answer. In the proposal delivered to Congress, there's a little reference to the reserve component, other than to say that it will be part of the 15,000 people in the Space Force. What staff was told last week at a briefing was that the department was not really sure what the reserve component's role would be until we stood up the active component, and that it would take additional legislation to make clear what the role of the Space Force Guard and Reserve look like. If we vote on this Space Force later this year, or in spring, early summer, whenever, I'm being asked by the department to vote on a proposal that does not have a real plan for our National Guard or Reserve, which is a big constituency base of mine. So my question would be, if total force is going to be as important to the Space Force as it is to other branches, isn't it important that we think critically about the reserve components?
Senator, it's impossible for me to imagine a Space Force without a reserve component.
There's no plans. I'm saying you're moving without that in part of your plan right now as we see it.
I'm very happy to work with you to make that more specific.
You all do have it. You get more specific with that?
I think we're happy to work with you on that. There are, within the Air Force, some particularly Guard units that have space.
Very much so. I know that. But I'm saying if you have something, we haven't seen it yet, I'm sorry, but if you could share that with us, it would be very helpful. I can relieve a lot of tension. Yes, sir, General.
Senator, if I could just talk about where I think we are. So there's a number of issues. You know, I've looked through this and had some of the same concerns you have. There's a number of issues unresolved, and the real question before the committee is, do we stand up the organization and get that four-star leader singularly focused on what the right organizational construct is, or do we wait for the perfect organizational construct to stand it up? And where I fell was to move out and refine as we go, and the committee will have plenty of time to provide oversight. So the initial first step to take in this next fiscal year would be stand up the organization, get the leadership in place, and then begin to address these very important issues, one of which you raised.
Okay. Let me go a little bit further. You talk about the culture. This whole new Space Force is of a culture, right? And you want to diversify it. Well, I can tell you, the Army has a certain culture. The Marines definitely have a certain, they're in first. They're going with the guns and blazing. The Air Force, basically, the culture has always been the same. This is where the space professionals have come from. This has basically been your bailiwick. How are you going to change that culture when everyone's still going to come from the Air Force? Or what culture do you think to diversify?
Senator, our focus on changing culture is to shift from providing a service to the other combatant commanders with almost like a utility to a warfighting ethos. And we're doing that within the space cadre of the Air Force today in the way in which we train our people, the way in which we assign them. Just as one example, we have people who operate satellite systems at Schriever Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. They spend 4 months on the floor operating their satellite systems in a peacetime environment, and then 4 months in training for a contested environment and how they would operate.
Secretary, I'm just having a real, and I think Secretary Shanahan and I have talked about, I'm having a real hard time understanding why we need this other agency. You've got everything at your disposal right now. And this doesn't make any, I'm just having a hard time with it. I'm trying to understand it and Secretary was very patient with me, trying to explain it. But you've got, if I had everything you all have at your disposal right now, and the Air Force has that expertise, and there's some flaws in it, and you want more attention to it, we'll give you what you need. This doesn't make any sense to me at all. I'm sorry. Secretary, I know you. You want to take another shot at me?
No, I'm happy to take another shot at it. That's why we're here, I think.
Go ahead and give me your spiel again, because they might want to hear why you think we need this other agency.
Yeah. The very short story is the amount of change that's taking place in this environment we're not prepared to address.
The way you're set up now.
The way we're set up now.
But can't you redirect what you have within the Air Force right now, which is where most of the culture is going to stay? It's not going to go over to the Marines. It's not going to the Army. Yeah. It's staying right over there.
Yeah. Yeah, so most of this is really within the Air Force, and as Senator Tillis was talking about restructuring, this is a fundamental shift that now treats space as a domain. So the culture is changed because the mission has changed.
Okay.
The leadership will change. The prioritization of the resources will change, and then our approach to developing capability will change.
I got you. Let me just, if I can lead into this, back to Secretary Wilson. Secretary, you've also publicly stated you didn't think the Space Development Agency is a good use of resources, citing the Air Force's own Space Rapid Capabilities Office as an effective acquisition body. Can you elaborate on why you think our money and effort is better invested in processes and organizations that already exist, which is the point I'm trying to make?
Senator, the Space Development Agency is not part of the President's proposal or the legislation in front of you. And the first project that this agency is apparently going to take on is actually funded by the Air Force and is in our budget. It's how do we use low Earth orbit commercially based satellite constellations. It's in our budget at $140 million over 5 years and is intended to be.
It's in your purview also. I mean, that's part of your bailiwick.
That is, and it's, we propose to do it with DARPA. The question is how best to buy them and whether we need a new agency to do so.
Do we need a new agency just to get in a lower orbit?
I think so.
Are we justifying a new agency just to get in a lower orbit?
Senator, it's what I'm saying here is not new. My memorandum to the Secretary on this subject has been reported on publicly, and I did not support it.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for being here. And I've only been in the Senate for, well, less than 4 months, but this is the most fascinating 2 hours so far. So thank you all for being as prepared as you are. I'm going to summarize a few things I've heard this morning before I run out of time to do that, and then ask some questions. General Dunford, you said space is no longer a sanctuary. I think Secretary Wilson, you both said it's now contested. Great points, important points. General Hyten, you said there will be a Space Force one day, and I'm going to hone in on that, because we hear a lot of reluctance, a lot of questions about the efficiencies, the business model. You've answered them all brilliantly, not necessarily convincingly, maybe to some, but I think you've answered those questions very well. Secretary Shanahan, you said something interesting. I want to go through maybe a little history. You said the existing forces are based on a place, on geography. I think it's an important point that sometimes we're missing when we draw parallels between this and other efforts and missions. As you said that, I started thinking about the Air Force itself, that the Air Force wasn't always the Air Force. It was once the Army Air Force, and prior to that was the Army Air Corps, and prior to that there weren't airplanes. That as new domains became contested, we had to lead. I was also thinking about some other proverbs, including Proverbs, where it says that without vision, the people perish. I'm pretty sure it was a Minnesota Viking fan that said the logical conclusion of defense is defeat. Being second is not a great place to be, and I know we're first, but I just feel so strongly that if we're going to have a Space Force one day, why wouldn't we start sooner rather than later? Why would we let somebody else get there? And so from a strategic standpoint, and I guess I'd ask the generals first about this, how important is it to have this public kitchen table level discussion? I appreciate your terminology, Secretary Wilson, when you said the President has elevated this topic to a kitchen table level. I think that's exactly right. But our adversaries are watching. They're probably watching this hearing right now. How did China and Russia roll out their space forces or their space activity? Did they do it in a real outward way, or did they try to do it under the radar? Maybe the generals could answer that for me. And is it important, by the way, that we send a message?
Senator, I don't mean to be flippant, but the Russian military and the Chinese military are not typically afforded the opportunity we have been afforded this morning in full transparency with initiatives like this.
And Senator, the Chinese and the Russians both look at space as a critical element of their defensive capabilities as their military. They've also organized differently about space. The Chinese are integrating a lot of their capabilities into a single command, space, counter space, those into a single command. They have an officer responsible for space, an officer responsible for counter space. I'd be glad to talk to you in a different setting about what I think they're doing and what the strengths of what they're doing and the weaknesses are, but I really don't want to talk about that in a public forum.
I appreciate both answers very much. We've had a lot of discussion about cost and benefit, and I understand the concerns of a couple of years or several years of cutbacks that now have us in catch-up mode on readiness and lethalness and all those things that are important. And I appreciate the answer, Chairman Dunford, about this is part of readiness. This is probably essential to readiness. But maybe, Secretary Shanahan, is a cost-benefit analysis, a literal cost-benefit analysis even, is that a possibility here?
No, it is, and implicit in the Space Development Agency is a cost-benefit analysis. It's a twofer. More capability sooner at a lower cost. And that's this is about moving more quickly. I mean, this is a threat-driven response, and it's really not even a response, as I think what the chairman's been highlighting here, is how do we get ahead of things? The other piece here, and we've touched on it briefly, is we're about to usher in a new age of technology. I mean, this is, we're on the dawn of some major changes, and if we adapt properly, we'll be able to take advantage of it and, again, increase our dominance in space.
And maybe just the last question for Secretary Wilson, then, with that in mind, I mean, are the increments important? I appreciate what my colleagues are saying about, but what about, why isn't this in the plan, or why isn't that part of the proposal, and, whether it's, the Guard or reserves or other things. And yet, aren't the increments sort of an important part of the rollout? In other words, we're not going from here to here. We see here, but we're going incrementally. Is that not an important part of the strategy?
I'm not sure it's incremental. I do think that that what we have now is a set of programs that support a strategy to dominate in space. And we all prefer that space remains peaceful, because everyone loses if war extends into space. But we are developing the capabilities to deter, and if necessary, to fight and win in the space domain as we do in all other domains, so that our adversaries will choose wisely to deal with our diplomats and not with our warfighters. And that's what this is about.
Beautifully said. Thanks to all of you. And I might just wrap up my comments by saying I just don't want to be sitting here 4 years from now and have 4 people look at me and go, I wish we would have started this 4 years ago. With that, I yield.
On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all very much for being here and for your responses. I totally agree with everything that you all said in your opening statements about the importance of space, the competition for space that we have entered into, space as the next potential battleground. I may even be convinced in the future that we need a new space command, and I do appreciate President Trump's focusing on space. I just have questions based on what I've heard and what I understand, and maybe I need to know more, that we have not gotten there in terms of the planning and the commitment, and that rather than spending a lot of time debating and questioning which direction we're going to go, we'd be better to continue to work on that and focus on what we need to immediately to address the challenges that we're facing. So let me begin with that and ask, I share Senator Manchin's concern about the failure to address Guard and Reserve as part of any planning for a new space command. It's a question, as you all alluded to, I guess it was you, General Dunford, that our Secretary Wilson, that many of our National Guard folks are already doing work in space, and so I think they have a question about what their future role might be in any new space command. So I think answering those questions is going to be very important in order to ensure that there is support from states who control the Guard. But I want to go on to the whole civilian side of this question, because as I understand, as space activity increases, as our ability to detect debris improves, and right now my understanding is that DOD tracks more than 20,000 objects in space, and that number continues to grow, and that we are making investments in situational awareness in space. I had the opportunity to see some of that recently, to try and track some of that space debris, and that the space policy directive of this administration contemplates a larger role for the Department of Commerce in space situational awareness and space traffic management. We just had a hearing with the Commerce Committee last week where they were talking about reorganizing all of the space elements in the Department of Commerce into the Office of the Secretary. So I'm trying to figure out which functions would actually go to Commerce and which would stay in DOD, and how that responsibility gets sorted out.
Senator, I think I can take that one. The Air Force has really, since the late 1950s, taken on the responsibility of warning people when a piece of debris might hit their satellite. We do that out of Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. You're right that we currently track about 24,000 pieces of debris that are larger than 10 centimeters, and we provide that information to every country in the world. We are also expanding our ability to know what is going on in space. This year, we will go operational with something called the Space Fence out of Kwajalein, which is a space-facing radar, and we will increase the number of pieces of debris that we're tracking to probably over 100,000 with that space fence, and it'll go out to geosynchronous orbit. The shift to the Commerce Department is that they will take over the responsibility of telling commercial companies and deconfliction and those things, and we're working very closely with them. We're happy to transition that responsibility of working on commercial space, on space traffic management, to the Commerce Department. They have had people out working alongside our folks at Vandenberg on how that would probably work. As the military service, obviously we would continue to have space situational awareness and collect the data. We would feed that over likely to the Commerce Department, who would combine it with other sources of data and work with industry.
And would that be the plan in any new space command that's operational?
The concept is that Vandenberg would be part of the Space Force, and the Combined Space Operations Center there is where we have all of the services as well as our allies and partners that track space debris.
But we would continue to shift the collection of that information to the Department of Commerce?
Yes, ma'am.
General Hyten.
So that mission today is accomplished by airmen in the United States Air Force. but it's under my command, U.S. Strategic Command. And we provide that data, and we have today 98 space situational awareness sharing agreements with others. We have to do that because we want to be able to operate safely in space, but it's not a military mission. That's a civil mission, and the Department of Commerce is just taking over that civil responsibility so we can focus on the warfighting market. But I met with Secretary Ross this week. He's not going to try to build all of the data and the sensors that we have in order to do that. He'll take our sensors and all our data, and he will just become the face to the commercial sector and the face of the world, so the military doesn't have to do that. But that function that's in STRATCOM will transition to the SpaceCom.
And so will the personnel who are currently working at STRATCOM transition to the Department of Commerce? Is that the plan?
No, ma'am. The Department of Commerce will have that front-facing piece, the airmen of the United States Air Force today that would be in the Space Force in the future, working for the Space Command. They still have to do that mission so we can do our defense of mission and our space control missions in the future. That's why we started doing that. We just fell into the space traffic management business. We do it for defense.
No, I'm just concerned about the expertise that might be required in the Department of Commerce, and are they going to have to hire that new? Are they going to take it from the Air Force?
We're working very close with them to understand what kind of personnel requirements they would have to have, how they would do that. In the conversations I had with Secretary Ross this week, what I pointed out is that if we do it right, most of the capabilities they need can actually be automated and acquired through commercial agreements. So they wouldn't have to have this army of people doing that. They could do it a whole lot better if we do it right from the beginning, and we're working closely with them to make sure we do it as efficiently as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, Senator Blackburn, please.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank each of you for being here today, and I want to thank you for the time that you've spent individually with us. I may be the outlier on this panel, but I totally appreciate why you need to have a Space Force. I get it. You know, when you look at technological advancement, when you look at 5G that is coming on, you look at the cyber pressures, you look at that lower orbit component, when you look at the integration that is taking place in the new space economy, I fully understand why you need to make this a priority and why you need to focus on this, why we as a nation need to focus on this, because 21st century warfare is most likely, from what I understand, going to be a good bit different than what we have seen in times past. So I appreciate that we are putting an emphasis on this so that we're not left and caught flat-footed at some point when we need to respond. Secretary Wilson, I want to say all good wishes as you leave. It truly is an honor to have you here, and we appreciate the work you've done, whether you were wearing the uniform or in the House or here. And of course, I thoroughly enjoyed serving in the House and on Energy and Commerce with the Secretary. And I know because of that expertise, you do have an understanding of the commercial side and also of the military side. It is a unique perspective. One of the things I do want to come to, and Secretary Shanahan and I discussed this a little bit, as you look at this new space economy that is growing, and Senator Duckworth talked a little bit about the Chinese, and of course we've discussed this. You don't know where their commercial sector and their military sector end and begin because they're one and the same. And that is a great power competition. And we want to make certain that we are focused on what that means. So are we doing enough to encourage and leverage the dynamism of the commercial space industry so that we are going to be able, as we conduct this transition, to meet our national security needs? And Secretary Shanahan, I want to hear from you briefly on that. And then, since we are near the end of this hearing,
I would like to just go down the dais. Anything that you all want to add that you haven't had the opportunity to add? Secretary, to you first.
Sure, thank you. I think we're in a unique opportunity, given that now we have to design and deliver capability that's more resilient, that we can draw in the advances the commercial space industry has developed. I mean, I think that's this unique point in time. That's why it's so important that when we do the development and the acquisition, we start at a different place than where we are today with our acquisition system. And there are two big opportunities. One is we systems engineer the ecosystem to draw in launch, to draw in the ground segment, to draw in 5G. It's not about how do we procure a microsatellite or a CubeSat. It's how do we design this system so we can ingest large volumes of data that we're going to take.
With a focus on interoperability.
Correct.
And cross-platform.
Yes.
And integration of all the different agencies that come under DOD.
No, absolutely, and we'll benefit.
I think that is a very important point.
Thank you.
Yes. Secretary Wilson, anything to add?
Senator, with respect to architectural design, the Air Force has just finished a 90-day study looking at looking at the threat, looking at the phases of conflict, looking at all of our missions, and calculating and doing about several thousand iterations of war games to figure out what are the best architectures and how do we get there fastest to a defendable space. There are a few conclusions from that. One is that different missions require different solutions, that an increase in number of satellites, particularly large number of commercial satellites, helps, but numbers alone are not enough to prevail. We also found that the congressional direction to consolidate all of space communications under the Air Force is actually a tremendous step forward, and I can explain in classified session why that would be. And then the space missions that are not well aligned with commercial low Earth orbit satellite systems should probably stay where they are, possibly with changes in protection, but that using only commercial space, so putting hundreds of small, cheap satellites into orbit does not work as a strategy. And it would mean that in combat, that low Earth orbit system would be quite vulnerable and would fail. So this is a complex problem. We've done some pretty good wargaming, and we will be happy to come up and brief the committee at their convenience.
Appreciate it. General Hyten, anything to add?
Senator, I'll just say it's all about the threat. How do we stay ahead of the threat? The threat right now, especially in China, is going much faster than we are. We have a significant advantage over them, but that's the advantage of history and what we've built over the last few years. We have to stay ahead of them, and I just thank this committee, thank the Congress for taking on the threat. When it comes right down to it, that's
General
what it's all
Dunford.
about.
Senator, the only thing I'd say in the interest of time would be that, we really have two choices. Either have a bias for action now and move out and establish an organization knowing that there's many questions to be answered, or wait until we have all the questions answered before we stand up the organization. And my best military advice, given the importance of space and the consequences of not doing all we can to optimize the department to move forward in space, would be move out now with what might be the 80% solution, refine as we go, and the committee will have an opportunity to provide oversight to address some of the issues that have been raised this morning.
Thank you for the service.
Thank you. On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, Senator Heinrich, please.
Thank you, Ranking Member Reed. I guess first I just want to say, as somebody who's ranking member right now on strategic forces and sits on Intel and obviously sits on this committee, and as somebody who has oftentimes fought the Pentagon over the last decade about the value of disaggregated space architecture and rapid capabilities, I really appreciate the focus we have on space right now. I think it is welcome. There are disagreements on or at least some skepticism about this construct at this point. But I think all of us can agree that this is a conversation that's been coming for a long time, and we need to have it. I want to pivot from Space Force real quick to Space Development Agency for a minute and just ask Secretary Shanahan and General Dunford. One of my concerns there is that we aren't simply shifting money and missions around to do what we're already doing at places like Space Rapid Capabilities Office, Air Force Research Labs, SMC, and some of the things that are working under the current construct. So just what assurances can you provide that we're not reinventing the wheel, but we're adding value?
I think there are two domains or two capabilities that the department is going to invest in its modernization, and it has to do with command and control and communications, and then Earth observation. Each of the services has its own plan. So it's really more about the systems engineering and the architecture rather than the technology that's being developed at the RCO. We do need to, when we look across all of the labs, start to make decisions on what are the standards we want to employ? Not necessarily direct technology development, but how do we develop standards so integration becomes more seamless and less costly?
Yeah, I would not disagree. And I think as we're looking at this, I think there's some real value in looking at co-locating the new SDA with some of the existing ecosystem so that we get those economies of scale. General Dunford, do you have anything to add to the Secretary's comments there?
The only thing I'd say, Senator, is, I mean, this makes sense to me as an initial step, and I think the broader question you're asking about is how do we make sure that all the processes in the department are aligned?
Right.
And that's going to be, the responsibility of all of us to ruthlessly drive alignment over time, ruthlessly drive efficiencies over time, and get this thing moving and make the refinements that I know are going to come. It's probably only one thing I'm 100% confident of as I sit here this morning, and that is 5 years from now, it's going to look slightly different than it does today, or what we propose today.
Great. Secretary, I want to talk a little bit about NRO. Obviously, a lot of exposure to that on one of my other committee assignments, and they have a pretty unique role right now, both under Title 50 and under Title 10, and I think they're working well. Can you give some certainty around, is NRO in or out of the White House legislative proposal right now, and what's the logic?
It's out,
right.
And it's not out because there aren't enormous synergies.
Mm-hmm.
It's really out because of organization and agreement on timing and alignment. There are a lot of details. This is General Dunford's point about how quickly can you move. We can move out on the things we can control. It doesn't mean that we couldn't move out in the integration with NRO. To your earlier point around architectures and technology, as we build out the future, we need to be provisioning with the NRO because that integration is going to take place in the future. And if we do that, it makes the integration that much easier in the future.
I think that's probably the right answer. I know there are some questions on this committee about where that belongs, but I think that's the right approach. Secretary Wilson, General Hyten, I wanted to ask you, I know we talked before about the importance of leveraging small space and commercial assets, and last week you spoke about blackjack, but I'm more interested in the issue around giving small launch providers an opportunity to put some of these small sats in place. Does this space proposal do anything more to leverage that emerging industry to meet our national security objectives? And is there a place where, is that one place where SDA might also play a role?
Senator, the Air Force is responsible for launch, but as you know, we don't build rockets, we buy launches.
Right.
The biggest challenge is on the heavy end, but on the light end, we have a variety of things that we're doing, and General Hyten may be able to add to this some, but we have contracted, for example, with Virgin Galactic to launch off of the under the wing of a 747. We are working with a number of very small, very innovative companies on different ways to launch, and launch flexibility and reconstitution from unexpected places is one of the ways in which we keep our adversaries guessing.
General.
And Senator, we've made a lot of progress in the last few years of taking advantage of that. I think one of the strengths of the proposal that's before you, though, is the structure we're proposing will allow us to better leverage all of the industry that this country has to offer. And we've struggled a little bit with the commercial sector in particular. We've struggled with the smaller companies figuring out how to do that.
Right.
The Air Force recently has made huge progress in walking down that path. I think Space Development Agency can walk down to real commercial leverage. So I think the total of this proposal really gets after a lot of the things you're talking about.
Thank you. Mike.
Thank you. On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, Senator Hawley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. Thank you for your work, your diligent work on this important proposal and this important topic. You've nearly made it to the end here. So just 6 minutes to go. I want to ask you about a few specific challenges. We talked a lot this morning about the space domain, the importance of the space domain in general. Let me ask you about some of the challenges, as I understand them, that make the space domain important, and you can tell me if my understanding needs revision. One of the major issues, as I understand it, that makes space so important is our global C4ISR architecture that runs through space, sort of the central nervous system of the joint force. We were able to build that central nervous system in and through space in years past because it was largely uncontested space. But now, as you've said over and over today, it's contested, it's congested, it's competitive. And so our C4ISR and precision navigation timing networks are at risk. So what I want to ask you is, what are we doing to make our global C4ISR networks and our PNT networks more resilient and survivable? And how does the Space Force, how will a Space Force contribute to that? Absolutely. Go ahead, General.
So, Senator, I think you described the space challenge quite well. I think we have a significant element of everything that we do that goes through space. There's not a single military operation that exists on this planet that doesn't involve space some way, and the C4 network that we operate leverages space, especially because we operate away from our homeland. We operate overseas. And when you do that, you need to bring your communications, bring your ISR, bring all those capabilities with you, and a significant amount of those capabilities today come from space. And so as we look to the future, we have to make sure we protect that and we defend that, and we can still provide those capabilities. And our adversaries have seen that too. And as they've seen that, they're developing capabilities to counter those. So we have to adjust. We have to be able to build different architectures that we can fight with more effectively, that can guarantee that capability is always there. We have to build the ability to defend ourselves and the ability to deny an adversary the use of space at a time and place of our choosing if we have to. As the Secretary discussed earlier, we don't want conflict to go into space, but if it does, we have to.
And in this setting, General, can you give us some idea about what are some of the steps that we are taking now or that need to be taken to make that infrastructure, that C4 infrastructure architecture and our PNT architecture more resilient? I mean, what I'm driving at is, I think you could see is, what are the specific things we need to be doing to meet this very pressing challenge? And then how does that tie into this large structural change that you've been proposing here today?
So the Secretary described one of the big changes is the integration of satellite communications in one place. As we move to a Space Command and a Space Force, the benefits that we'll get from that unity of effort will be we'll have one command focused on operating satellite communications, and we'll have one force looking at acquiring the capabilities we need to. And the integration of those two capabilities will allow us to better defend ourselves and operate in the future. You can apply that to position, navigation, and timing. You can apply that to overhead weather, missile warning. All the capabilities we have, you apply that same concept. And we can talk in a classified session about the specifics of what we're doing, but in broad terms, that's the structure.
Madam Secretary, you want to add to this?
Senator, before the fiscal year 19 budget that we brought up before your election, we did some work on what should our strategies be and how do we shift our programs to implement those strategies. And we did a tabletop exercise with many of the members of the committee to show what the strategies were and the program shifts. Those strategies really kind of revolve around 5 things in general. The first is to protect and defend. So defend our satellites, think chaff and flares, but other kinds of things. And it's different mission by mission. Second, be able to stop an attack. It's not good enough to stand in the ring and dodge and weave and take punches. You need to be able to swing back. Third, proliferate. Now, proliferation alone does not solve the problem, but it does complicate the problem for an adversary. Fourth, undermine the confidence of the adversary that they really understand what's going on around them. And fifth, all of this rests on a foundation of excellence in our people. So those are the 5 lines of effort, and they're all supported by programs and programmatic change that was supported by the committee in the FY19 budget.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I think that, my set of questions around your proposal for this major structural change for the standing up of a Space Force relates to this line of questioning. I mean, what are the specific pressing challenges we face in that domain, and will this new structure help us meet those specific challenges? Or is there a danger that we're too focused on the domain as a domain and we're not focusing enough on the specific challenges? Mr. Secretary, before my time expires, let me just ask you a somewhat related question. The relevance of AI and new technologies. You touched on this briefly, I think, with Senator Kramer, but tell us something about how the Space Force may help the Joint Force continue to develop the new technologies, whether it's AI or otherwise, that we need to be leaders here in the 21st century.
Right. So the Space Development Agency, in our modernization for the National Defense Strategy, addresses building an integrated transport layer for the Department of Defense so that we can ingest and move significant volumes of data that facilitate artificial intelligence. It's this build-out of the broader infrastructure. It also includes the ground network that'll connect sensor and shooter, and then all other decision makers. It's not just about closing the fire control loop, but we're trying to scale and address latency. And this is why we need fundamental systems engineering as we approach this problem set.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, Senator Blumenthal, please.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your service. I've been in and out as I've attended other committee hearings, and I sort of feel like the most important facts for us and the American people to understand are the facts that haven't been said today. And the reason why they haven't been said is that they are largely classified. And the reason that's important is that the American people have no idea, really no idea, about the immensity of the threat in space. And I've made this comment in a classified setting, that I wish the American people could be present in this room, not this room, but the SCIF, because our adversaries know what they are doing. We know what they are doing. They know we know what they are doing, but the American people have no idea. And so this discussion and debate will have very little interest in the American public. It's carried on in a level of, forgive me, bureaucratic language that most Americans would have trouble seeing an immediacy in their daily lives. But if they were privy to what we hear, and you know it much better than we do because you live it, I think they'd be pretty alarmed. This is not by way of criticism of you, because you're living with the strictures of what is classified and not, but I think we have a real obligation to explain to the American people why space is a domain that matters, why the threats there are real and urgent, why they are growing in importance. So I think we all agree here that space is an important domain. Undersea warfare is an important domain, but we don't have a separate command for it. Cyber is an important domain, as my colleague and friend, the late John McCain, used to say. And so I found very persuasive, Secretary Wilson, what you said in July of 2017. I know it's been quoted to you before this morning, and others of you, the reasons for your opposition to that separate domain or the separate command for the space domain. But I would like to ask, in terms of the personnel issues that I think are of immediate concern to a lot of folks, this proposal would exempt Space Force civilian personnel from Title V rules and protections. It would create a new accepted service that is separate from the federal government competitive service or a senior executive service. It would create an alarming precedent, I think, that potentially could erode the merit-based civil service within the Pentagon and eliminate the rights of Space Force employees to participate in collective bargaining, for example. There's currently no civilian workforce that is statutorily exempt from collective bargaining rights. Can you tell me, Secretary Shanahan, why that is a part of your proposal?
The Title V that you were referencing was based on the discussion we were having earlier around integration with the NRO. That's the model that they employ there. And as we think about the talent management practices that we'll need in the future, we wanted a provision for that. Much like in your reference to the undersea domain, our approach to systems engineering is the same as the Navy's undertaken. So there are a lot of examples that we're trying to draw from that have been successful. That was the nature of that insertion.
Would there be protection for whistleblowers in the same way there is throughout the rest of the government?
The baseline that we're coming off of is the existing personnel system. This was to incorporate, the ability to integrate with the NRO. So I would, I'd have to go back, sir, I'd have to go back and confirm that for you. But
if you would, that would be appreciated.
You bet.
Because based on this proposal, the Secretary of Defense could terminate any Space Force employee, quote, in the interests of the United States, end quote, and as drafted it says, notwithstanding any other law, which leads me to think that they would be exempted from a lot of other protections of law and could simply be dismissed whenever you determine it's in the interest of the United States.
Yeah, let me go back and confirm that that's not our interpretation.
My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I think there are essentially, and I have a lot more, and I'm going to submit them for the record, a lot more questions than answers here. And as others have remarked, each of you has raised objections or reservations or questions in the past, the very recent past, about this idea, which I'm not sure have been fully addressed here. Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we're here today to examine a proposal to set up a Space Force within the Air Force. And before we haul off and authorize spending billions of dollars on this, I just want to ask a couple of questions about what problem this Space Force is supposed to solve. So let me start with you, Chairman Dunford. Is it correct to say the Department of Defense has proposed a Space Force because the U.S. is at risk of losing its competitive advantage in space, and our space assets, including critical satellites, are becoming increasingly vulnerable? Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement, Senator. And just a quick caveat based on your opening comment, and the organization that we have today is an organization that we built when space was not.
No, I understand that. I understand that. So I want to think about, though, what the basis of the problem is then. A 2016 GAO report that examined our existing space acquisition programs noted, quote, "We and others have reported for over 2 decades that fragmentation and overlap have contributed to program delays and cancellations, cost increases, and inefficient operations," end quote. Secretary Shanahan, is it the DoD's view that unifying space programs under a single service will address these problems?
Senator, unifying and aligning certain programs under the Space Development Agency will address that problem that you spoke to.
So you say the problems of delays and cancellations, cost increases, and inefficient operations will be solved if there is a separate branch of the military but still under the command of the Air Force. You know, this is particularly surprising to me since the proposal to leave the Space Force headquartered under the Air Force would still leave exactly one person responsible for acquiring hardware for both the Space Force and the Air Force. So it's not clear to me how this solves anything. In fact, it's hard to see how that person would be able to balance the competing needs of both services without a massive increase in overall spending. So, Secretary Shanahan, let me ask, obviously DoD has not been able to solve the problems identified by the GAO over the last 20 years. Why do you think another layer of bureaucracy will suddenly solve this problem?
Well, I think the department solved a lot of problems. I think we can point to a lot of programs where inefficiencies, delays in decisions, redundancies, overlaps have been corrected. I think there's a...
Well, I'm sorry, the report is from 2016 from the GAO saying you have not solved these problems.
And all I'm arguing is we've made lots of improvements, and we can point to...
And how is having one person, as you have now, in charge of the acquisitions for these two programs, Space Program and the Air Force, how's that going to solve the problems that were identified by the GAO?
Well, specifically, there are a set of fragmented programs today that will be consolidated, and they'll allow us to get at many of the issues identified in the GAO report.
There's just one person in charge right now, and you still haven't fixed this problem.
No, this isn't about one person. This is about an organization that has certain capabilities and decision rights.
Well, look, I understand that DoD says that unifying space acquisitions is going to help improve outcomes, but I'm concerned that it won't, because program delays and cancellations, cost increases, and inefficient operations are the rule, not the exception. And the entire defense acquisition system already has this problem, and nothing in this proposal makes it any better. You know, none of the ideas I've heard today clearly spell out how a Space Force leads to improved security in space. Instead, all I see is how a new Space Force will create one more organization to ask Congress for money. And there's no reason to believe that adding an entirely new Space Force bureaucracy and pouring buckets more money into it is going to reduce our overall vulnerability in space. I just think the taxpayers deserve better than this. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warner. On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me thank the witnesses for their testimony and declare that the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Joe.
Fred, I gotta run. I know. I'll walk with you.
Coming up this evening, the director of the National Institute